Hi, everybody. It's Patricia Coughlin. I've been away from the channel for a while. I have been sick, like all year. All year. Yeah, but that's been 3 or 4 weeks. I took a little break there. But I wanted to respond to a question that a subscriber had about working with feelings and impulses in the current, even with people who seem random or unimportant. So I thought this was a good question, and it was one that is actually tied to the last one, right? Which was really focusing on the ways in which the visceral somatic experience of anxiety laden feelings that are typically avoided is really the trigger that unlocks the unconscious. And having that happen, actually in the transference, in the here and now, tends to evoke the widest opening into the unconscious. But that's not something that you can create, right? So I'm going to discuss that whole issue of the transference in the next video. But in this one, we'll talk about working with current figures. Okay, so we're talking about that triangle of person, people in the current life, the transference, and the past. So again, often when we're talking about working with feelings toward people in the current, we're usually talking about important people in the patient's current life, their spouse, their siblings, their children, their boss, their coworkers, things like this. And if we can, we'll often start by examining feelings toward these people, especially if some kind of conflict with them in the current triggers symptoms. That's what we're really after, right? Is getting to the bottom of the patient's symptomatic and also sometimes character difficulties. So if somebody has a panic attack after a meeting with the boss, we are going to examine that, right? What happened and what kinds of feelings the patient has toward the boss. But again, this can also happen with current triggers with people who the patient doesn't even know. And I have a couple of examples here. So one that I showed for those who attended the webinar I did on Monday, this man who was very, very depressed and in fact even had a suicide plan if the therapy didn't work, was extraordinarily detached from his own feelings. And as we began to examine feelings toward me, toward the wife, we could see that his anger would immediately, either go into just critical, judgmental thoughts or back on himself, right, with the depressive mechanism. Or occasionally, like he said, I can get bitchy. So from that very critical, judgmental place, he could actually be very critical and judgmental of others. But in neither case was he actually experiencing the anger, right? Those were both defenses against the experience of anger, which were causing other problems. So I worked on this depressive mechanism with him throughout the initial trial therapy. And even though it was like too threatening for him to experience it directly toward me or toward his wife, somebody who was ambivalently held, what his unconscious alliance offered toward the end was he said, well, speaking of anger, and again, he was mobilized at this point. He was much more activated. He said, there's a what you call an intersection near my home, and I get so angry when people go through the stop sign, and I'm just waiting for somebody to do it so I can smash them and so on. And so I went with it, right? So even though, some random person in his imagination, it allowed him to have this experience of anger and to face that when he's angry with somebody who cuts him off, that he actually wanted to take the tire iron and attack the person, right? Not just the car. And yet that also horrified him, right? It evoked, guilt. And so as he had this experience, he said, it's funny. I always heard, because I said something like, he said, well, okay, so I have these impulses, but I don't want to act on them. So I keep them inside, and I said, yeah, you beat yourself up instead. And he said, it's funny. I've always heard that depression was anger turned inward, but I never understood it until this moment. He said, I'm really happy I came here. You know that? So for me, for a man who was so depressed, he was suicidal, right, to have that experience and then to have that revival of hope was really important. So it sort of highlights the need to have a therapeutic experience and not to be so picky about exactly how that has to come about, right? So if I had stopped him from, because this was a random person, we wouldn't have had that. Another really interesting one comes to mind with, this was a very well-known person that I was treating, and they were being hounded by paparazzi. And he came in and he said, again, he had a symptom like he was having a panic attack because he had left his house for a coffee and these people were swarming. And so even though he didn't know them, they weren't significant. Obviously he had feelings toward them, right, which were getting redirected back on himself. So we went for it. And again, these tended to be men, and he really got in touch with this rage and wanting to smash this guy, smash his camera, smash him. And then spontaneously there was a link to his father, who really never paid much attention to him, was actually quite devaluing. And yet after he became well known, he went to his father's office and saw that he had like pictures of him around. And so even though he never told him, his son, that he was proud of him, he was kind of using his son, right, to shine on him. So you could see, right, the link between the paparazzi and the father. And then there was one other one. Oh, this was really interesting. And this was from a trainee of mine. So somebody who was in a core training, and they were presenting this case. And at first I'm thinking, what are you doing this for? But it turned out to be really effective. So this was a patient who had a phobia of driving on highways and interstates. He would get so anxious and panicky, he would have to pull over. So, of course, the therapist was trying to figure out, well, when did this start? And, what was happening in your life at that time? Trying to come up with something. And didn't really get anywhere. And so he just went to the, most recent example of when he had been on some, busy street and this had happened. And he just got the guy talking about it. So, you're in the car, and then what's happening is like, yeah, this guy, and it was always a guy in his mind, right, is riding my rear, coming up on the back of me, pushing me, all this kind of stuff. So as he just had him keep talking about his experience and what he thought this guy was trying to do, again, he spontaneously then made this link to his brother, his younger brother, who was very competitive and aggressive and always coming up behind him and then so he could actually face his feelings toward that brother instead of just panicking. So those are 3 examples of where it really turned out to be very, very productive. So again, one of the things I can say is just follow the unconscious alliance. If somebody brings up some example, even if it's with a stranger and it's related to the presenting problems, go for it and see what happens. So let me know, give me feedback. Bye-bye.